Welcome to episode 18 of the Animus podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Aftermath and McCracKenway, and with me today, as usual, is McCracKenway.
Hello.
And Aries is in Italy and probably forgot what day it was. And with us today, as a guest, is PutridMoldyman.
Hi.
Today, we're going to be talking about a bit about Putrid's time on the subreddit and elsewhere. Then we're going to talk a bit about various book things, and then we'll probably take a look at Arkham Knight, and then we'll move on to Ratonhnhaké and talk a little bit about him. Forewarning, at the exact time we're recording this, there is actually the San Diego Comic-Con Assassin's Creed panel going on at the same time, and so we may interject with some new info if anything comes from that.
I'm looking at it. I don't expect it to have a ton new stuff. So far, it seems pretty much a rehash of what we heard, but, you know, just in case.
So, Putrid, you're probably most well known for your time on the subreddit as a very active member. Could you tell us a bit about how you got into the games first of all before we get into the community? So, how did you get into the Assassin's Creed games from the beginning?
Okay, so around the time Assassin's Creed 2 came out, I used to watch Zero Punctuation, and I saw his review for AC2, and even though we didn't quite like it too much, thought it was too easy, from what I saw, it seemed a lot like Fable, which I was a big fan of at the time, and I'd heard a lot of good reviews for AC2 before, so I decided to look into it. When I looked into it more, definitely is not like Fable, but it still looked like a fun game, so picked it up. And then due to various reasons, I hadn't completed it in like over a year. Getting distracted by other games, a problem with my Xbox at the time, not being able to read discs. Eventually it had to come to a friend annoying me to actually finish Assassin's Creed 2. I didn't think I was going to actually get in the series. I thought I was just going to play AC2 and then that was it. But then I saw the ending and it was crazy and I loved it, and then I just picked up the games I missed. Pre-ordered Revelations. I was very excited.
So could you tell us a bit how you got into the online community and specifically the subreddit?
Yeah. I remember when the first images for AC3 were leaked, they had Connor walking through the wilderness with his bow and hunting, and I thought, oh, this is awesome. I was getting situated with Reddit at the time, and one thing I kept on hearing is that there's a subreddit for everything, so I'm going to see, is there a subreddit for Assassin's Creed? And of course there was. At the time I had not finished Revelations, so the AC3 leaks had encouraged me to finish Revelations, and once I was done with that, I started getting into the reading the subreddit very frequently, and then eventually commenting on it after like a month or two.
So for our main discussion point this week, we'll be talking a bit about lots of different types of books in relation to the AC series, because they're announcing lots of different things in preparation for all the different releases that are related to the AC games that will be coming out later this year. Probably one of the first things that comes to mind when you think about yearly releases compared to the AC books would be the novelizations of each of the games. And this year's novelization of Syndicate is called, I think it's called Assassin's Creed Underground. Is that what it's called?
Something like that, I believe.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And that focuses on Henry Green, who is the Indian assassin we see in the first gameplay videos that we had seen. News came out this week that he's actually Arbaz Mir's son, who is the starring character from Assassin's Creed Chronicles India, and also
Brahmin.
The
other comic book.
Yeah, exactly. The graphic novel, and a lot of people. This actually reminds me about when a lot of people were, when he was first revealed, a lot of people thought that he might be Arbaz himself, which doesn't make much sense, seeing as how he has like a British accent, although we could chalk that up to Ubisoft. And also, a lot of people saying name change and things like that, which also wouldn't make much sense either. But I'm glad that there is a tie-in, at least, even if... And I'm also glad that it's not actually he is Arbus, because that doesn't make much sense to me. I'm actually very excited to read about Henry Green's time in London and things like that, because he's Indian, and I assume that will give us quite a different view. I really loved Unity and Forsaken, so I'm definitely looking forward to this.
The books that kind of step back from the main story and talk about other characters, I think, are generally... I definitely say they're the best ones, just because there's more freedom, I think, to tell stories with them. Because, I mean, it's kind of the same issue with, like, going from a video game to a movie, is that they're different storytelling mediums, and, like, it's hard to capture, like, well, one of the reasons, you like Assassin's Creed is all this fun parkour stuff. And, I mean, that was kind of the same for Prince of Persia, and that movie did not do well because they're trying to focus on a story and also like, hey, look, the game mechanics that you love, sort of, except it's a movie, so you can't actually do anything but watch stuff. So yeah, I think that's where the books that follow, like, very closely the stories of the other games kind of fall down. But it's really great to have this expanded universe content that gives you more of a picture on the wider world of Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, I definitely like this transmedia content, especially when especially in the form of novels, which are some of the highest quality transmedia stuff that I've ever seen. I definitely enjoy my time with those consistently. Next up, we have the new Titan comic books. AC comic books created by the company Titan for Ubisoft. We're going to have two series of them. One will be focusing on Assassin, one Templar. We know that the one focusing on Assassin has given us they've released a cover already, which features a female modern-day assassin on the front, and we know that it will be focusing on the 17th century Salem witch trials for the historical time period, which should be very interesting. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of comic books as a medium. I much prefer graphic novels, because generally comic books are very short and they come out monthly. I definitely prefer one big session.
I don't mind comic books, but I only ever consume them when eventually they get released in graphic novels. Like, I just recently read through the Superior Spider-Man storyline, but I got it as, like, 3 or 4 graphic novels rather than, like, I didn't follow the comics monthly, because, I don't know, for me it's like, there's, even graphic novels are kind of like, they're expensive for like a relatively short period of enjoyment, and comics are like, even more so, but in addition, you're also waiting like months between, or like a month between installments, and it's like, I'm going to have 5 to 10 minutes of enjoyment every month on this one thing, and then I'm going to put it down and forget about it for a month. It's kind of like the same thing that's somewhat happening like with Telltale games right now when they release episodic games, and they've gotten to a point where they're the period of time between releases of episodes is like 3 months for some of their properties, and that's just ridiculous. Like, I don't remember what happened the last time I played this game. Kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how they give a take on it. And The Fall, another of the AC graphic novels, was released in 3 issues of a comic, and then it was packaged up into a graphic novel. So it'll be interesting to see if they will announce when these will, or if they will at all. I like the style that they're going for, with one series of issues is focusing on assassins, and a series of issues is focusing on Templars. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they handle both of those. Yeah, I'm very interested, and we know that there's going to be, didn't they say 5 to 6 variant covers for the Assassin?
I think so, yeah, there's supposed to be a couple.
Yeah. So that should be very interesting to see how they handle that. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see more.
5 to 6.
We haven't seen, we haven't heard too much about it other than just teasers and things like that. But it's coming out, the Assassin series of issues, the first issue of the Assassin series is coming out in October, I believe. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, that's what it says. Released in early October and followed up monthly. So it's going to be like, it's going to line up somewhat with the release of Syndicate, which I think they've done with a couple of their other multimedia things. Yeah.
That should be interesting. Next up, I do believe, is this very interesting one from the very interesting and surprise thing that we saw at Montreal Comic Con, which was the Assassin's Creed Complete Visual History, which I believe they described as like a full art book for basically all the games, and the cover features a morphed looking Altair SEO combined thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that should be really interesting. Like one of my Christmas gifts in the last year was the Assassin's Creed Unity art book, and it was really fascinating and beautiful, and made me want to play Assassin's Creed Unity again. Though honestly, that doesn't take much for me for some reason. But I can see one potential thing with this, because so Assassin's Creed has also released these encyclopedias, and the encyclopedias are really cool, but the thing about them is because they keep releasing games. So in the first encyclopedia released, it released alongside Revelations, and I got that one. So if you get the first encyclopedia, then you have an encyclopedia that's up to date with Revelations. But then as they keep making more games, then they release more encyclopedias that's like, well, now this one's up to date with Assassin's Creed 3. Now this one's up to date with Assassin's Creed 4. So if you actually want a complete encyclopedia of the series, then you're kind of always behind. And I could see that problem with this one, but it might also just be a fun one-off thing.
I completely understand what you're saying. It's once again, we've only heard some brief teasers, small pieces of news, things like that. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out over the course of the next few months, and as we learn more about what this art book includes, because is this the first one that spans multiple games?
I think so. I would be really interested to see. It's already concept art, so it's conceptual, but I think it'll be really interesting to see even a bit more, especially since it's spanning multiple games. So how do you conceive this massive multi-game series from this beginning point, and at what point are you planning out future things, and how are you designing that? And I think that'll be really interesting to get even more kind of conceptual behind the scenes stuff that we don't get as much.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it, at least. I think that there's a lot of stuff here, so I'm not sure how much I'm going to get, but I'm going to get as many as I can without going bankrupt.
Do we have any word on how big the complete visual history is supposed to be?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I remember the Unity one being pretty big, and there's two things I can imagine coming from this. Either a massive book with just everything about every game, or just a brief overview of each main game, with about the entire book being the length of Unity's art book, but I don't know.
I think it'll be interesting as well, rather than just doing it sequentially, this game into this game, they would try to draw maybe parallels between parts of the series, and connections between how we did this setting and how we did this setting, and what kind of common themes maybe we wanted to convey with this piece. Because that's kind of what the Unity art book does, is it goes into here's what I wanted to convey with this piece about this setting. I wanted to show that there's some mystery and some peace, but there's also there's these birds over here that have been disrupted, so there's a bit of a disturbance as well. And I think that in particular was really interesting, how they conceived of, because it's concept art, so how do you convey this concept? And I think it would be interesting to have, again, a series-spanning connective piece, I guess.
Yeah. I think it has the potential to be really cool.
Yeah, it should be really cool. Now, we've also, in relation to the books, continuing on from that subject, we've also, a few weeks ago, we received a question from the Cliffhangers on Twitter, aka Kate, and she wants to know what books we are currently reading. Now, a quick reminder, some of you may have forgotten that Arius wants all of your book recommendations because he doesn't know how to read, and he'd like some quick things to get a hold of real quick and learn how to read that way. So, I'm not actually quite reading anything at the moment. Recently, I read Fahrenheit 451, and I've been reading Flatland, which was interesting, which is a book about several different 2D, 3D, 1D, 0D, and it's very interesting. And I was reading 1984 as well, which is interesting. Basically
going through your classics.
Yeah, exactly. I actually kind of switch. The way I do it is that I switch between I'm reading a classic and then I read a something slightly more obscure, like just a random Napoleon biography or something like that, and then I switch back to another classic, and so I kind of flip flop between classics and just anything else, just to catch up on things that people mention that I actually haven't heard of or read before, and I enjoy that quite a bit. McCracKenway.
Well, I'm currently in the middle of 2 books. I started a book at the beginning of the summer that I've been reading the whole summer. It's called Why Nations Fail. It's a pretty interesting economic theory on why some nations are wealthy and some are not. And it goes into political reasons and reasons of human nature, and I think it's a pretty comprehensive, interesting read. Goes into a lot of different pieces of history. What I'm actually reading more right now, that's just for fun, is a book called The Autumn Republic. It's a fantasy book, sort of, that's set in a fictional parallel to the French Revolution, and it has mages that they do things with gunpowder and flintlocks and bullets and stuff, and that's a really interesting thing. And it's really fun. It's the third of a trilogy, and that's what I'm reading right now. But something that I will not talk about at length, but you should read, is anything by Terry Pratchett as well, because he is amazing.
Okay. Of course, I mentioned that recently I also read Forsaken and Unity, which I mentioned
again.
Yeah, I mentioned that just earlier as well. And those are some really, really good books. And if you're looking for something to read and you're a fan of AC, which I hope you are if you listen to this podcast, then you should definitely check out Forsaken and Unity, the novels. They're really good. Now, Putrid, I know you had a certain subreddit event going for you wee while that relates to this somewhat. Could you tell us a bit about what you're reading at the moment about that?
I'm not really reading anything at the moment. I'm putting them on pause. A couple books you all might have heard about. First one is more of a graphic novel. It's called Assassin's Creed: The Chain, and the other one is Forsaken. I actually haven't I haven't read either of those before, which it's interesting to see the actual stories that I've heard a lot about, and they're pretty well done. Very well done, actually. I'm pretty surprised how high quality all the transmedia stuff is.
Yeah, it's actually, you mentioned that actually earlier. It's all very, very high quality. Oliver Bowden, I believe, is the author's pen name. He writes really, really well, and I really enjoy his stuff quite a bit. And just reading through this stuff is just a blast, and it's really good. As I said a few times, that you should probably read through Oliver Bowden's novels, and also The Chain, The Fall, Brahman, and things like that, because they are all really, really high quality and really, really well done. Now, I believe it was last week, Batman Arkham Knight was released, and there were a lot of similarities between the games and the Arkham games and Assassin's Creed, and they've always been compared quite well together, mainly because of the third-person action-adventure style and very similar combat, especially when we entered the AC3, well, the Kenway trilogy era. For that time, the combat between the Arkham games and the AC games was very, very similar, so there's been a lot of comparison throughout basically both their entire franchise histories. Mm-hmm. And so we thought we could maybe talk about, now that myself and McCracKenway have both finished Arkham Knight and have experienced it, no spoilers, we thought we could talk a bit about some comparisons, what AC could learn from it, what Arkham could learn from AC. McCracKenway, I know that you want to talk a bit about this, so if you could lead us off on this one.
Yeah, well, first off, I want to say we have gotten shit for talking about other games before, and I think that's silly because, especially in this instance, Assassin's Creed does not exist in a vacuum. There are always other games, and a lot of games improve themselves by looking at other games and being like, what works for this game, and how can we kind of elicit a similar kind of feeling in this game. And especially Arkham Knight and the Arkham games, because they're often compared anyway, I think it's fair to talk about them. If we want to start off, we could just start with the comparisons that people make, which have always been Arkham Knight's combat. Well, actually, AC's combat is very similar to Arkham Knight, and, Arkham before Arkham Knight came out. And that right now there's a lot of talk that the rope launcher is just basically Arkham Assassin's Creed, which is somewhat fair, but I think as we talk about it, it's also less fair. Does anybody else want to say anything? Because you have your face in the bed.
No, I'm just sitting uncomfortably because I usually sit in my chair, but I'm currently not sitting well. There's a lot of comparison, especially drawn between even Luma, who actually Luma, who we had on last week, was a big fan of the Arkham games and had a chance to play Syndicate at E3, and he said that it definitely felt a lot like the grapnel gun from the Arkham games. So that's a very interesting. I think the grapnel gun's going to be. No, I'm sorry. The rope launcher is going to be a discussion for another day as a whole, but it's the link there is not only apparently aesthetically similar, but it's also very mechanically similar in a few different ways like that, which I think is very interesting, and I'll be interested to see how well it works and see if Ubisoft has pulled it off quite as well as Arkham has.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just zoned out. Were you just talking about the rope launcher?
Yeah, I was just talking about rope launcher versus grapnel gun.
Yeah, and I think that the thing about that as well is that I think functionally it'll feel very different. Whereas in the Batman games, especially Arkham City onwards, you use the grappling gun to launch yourself up into the air and glide, which you're not going to do in Assassin's Creed. That's not going to happen. You can't fly. So I think it's going to feel a lot different because Arkham is like especially Arkham Knight, you can launch yourself up into the air at high speeds and get across most of the city without having to ever touch down or grapple again. And Assassin's Creed is just going to be another tool to get around. That's going to be it's just going to add to your parkour, like the grappling hook in Arkham added to the gliding function.
Yeah, I can actually see your point there, and as you mentioned, especially in Arkham Knight now, there's definitely more focused on using the grapple gun as a way to launch into a glide and a further glide and a higher glide, and that's definitely one of the big differences, and probably one of the only main big differences between the rope launcher and the grapple gun. One thing that a lot of people, from what I've heard, are really, really enjoying is the side missions in Arkham Knight, and I think that's The side missions, the collectibles, and things like that are really something that AC could learn from the
Yes.
Arkham games.
Well, I think it's the great thing about the side content in Arkham is that it all somewhat, I mean, it's all very heavily story-based, but whereas, say, Assassin's Creed Unity had a bunch of Paris stories that are all kind of their own thing, and there's a couple that have like 3 missions that you can do like straight in a row if you want. Arkham kind of does it where the missions you have a lot fewer side missions, but they progress as the game goes on, so that they're almost kind of like their own standalone stories that work well with the rest of the fiction.
That's something that I really enjoyed with Arkham Knight. I think that got really, really, really right. Is the pacing in the game, especially in relation to the side missions, because a lot of games like AC games and The Witcher 3 as well, you can never tell. Like everyone wants to play through the side missions slowly as you play through the game, but because most of the time in games like these, the main story has you doing something urgently and something now. It feels strange as Connor to wander around the homestead doing nothing much. Meanwhile, you're supposed to be off finding Lee, or in The Witcher 3, killing random monsters for money instead of trying to find Ciri. But Arkham Knight gives you several different intervals where it's like, okay, this will be ready when you want it, but it's going to take me a little while before you can get this new gadget so you can move on.
Even though if you want, you can just move on immediately.
Yeah, you can move on immediately, exactly. But it just gives you a nice little interval where you can do that, do some side missions, and it makes sense and main story-wise. And I think that was, I really, really liked how that was done.
One of the reasons that it's really good that it has such good pacing is because, I don't think this is much of a spoiler, but it's sort of like Metroid, the more completion you have in the game, the more complete of an ending you get. So if you haven't played Arkham Knight, then my recommendation is to try to do the side content as you go along. Otherwise, it's going to be like, I don't know. I don't like to have a huge like backlog on my games where like a lot of stuff I have to do after I finish the main story. So personally, I tried to do everything as the game went along. But also, in the context of the story, there's one thing that I can say, because it's not a spoiler, but like the game takes place in one night, and with the context of how the game ends, it makes sense that he's juggling all these different cases at once, because he's Batman and he has to get all this cleaned up in a night. So it works really well with the story, and it feels focused and interesting and compelling, because you're like, there's one where you're hunting a grisly serial killer who turns out to be very, very creepy. There's some that are like returning threads from other games, which are very interesting. I think that's also helped by the fact that Arkham is a trilogy, so you can kind of like bring in threads and wrap up threads from previous games, which Assassin's Creed is currently very far from a trilogy. It hasn't done any returning characters for a long time, which I think is somewhat to its detriment, because it's sort of like with every game they almost reboot like the entire feel and story of the series.
Yeah, there's something special when a series of games in a franchise is just, it hits the ending, and it knows that, from the very beginning they've said that Arkham Knight was supposed to be the ending of the Arkham trilogy. Warner Brothers Montreal will probably make more Batman games, or probably make different Batman games, something like that, but this is the Rocksteady trilogy, and a franchise, it works really, really well when it's not open-ended, and it just cuts off and it finishes right then and there. And that's something that AC is never going to have, because they're just going to continue pumping up things. Now, that's not necessarily... it's not a deal breaker, but it definitely is nice to have a full ending.
Yeah. I think actually they have the potential to do it as many times as they like, I mean, they're never going to do it with the modern day because that's sort of why the series exists, like why you're doing things. So they can't wrap up the modern day, or that is the end of the series. But they could do lots of, I mean, past-based trilogies. Like, you know, they had the Ezio trilogy. So you get 3 games with this one person. By the end of his life, you can wrap up a bunch of threads and finish off him. And that's like the great strength of Arkham Knight, is that they can just be like, you know, this is the Arkham universe. We can do whatever we want as we end this. So there are some very big twists, and it does not pull like emotional punches in its story either. And it's very impactful, which, like, just having a standalone game, you don't get as much of a, I guess, like, the difference, like, people really, even if they didn't like, you know, necessarily Revelations as a game, they really liked Ezio's ending. They liked, you know, it's like, I've played this series. I don't necessarily want more of Ezio now because we've just wrapped him up and, like, we've had this satisfying conclusion to his story. So it's weird because, like, it seems like they're not going to do that. They very definitely said, like, we're not doing, like, recurring characters anymore. But really, honestly, like, that's one of the great things about the Animus, which was a genius invention in the first Assassin's Creed, and now it's kind of, like, out there. But I think that would be the way to go about it, is, like, take advantage of that trilogy potential, because you can have as many trilogies as you want now. You can wrap up one, go somewhere else, do another. Don't just do standalone games where, by the end, who cares if Elise dies? You saw her for, like, less than 15 minutes total anyway.
Yeah, I actually agree, actually. I didn't think about that. I didn't think about the Kenway saga got a really nice send-off with Rogue, and Ezio saga, a really nice send-off with Revelations, and so, yeah, they actually can have multiple different endings, so multiple different trilogies, multiple different groups of games. I like it. Yeah, it's a really good point, McCracKenway. Thanks for pointing that out. You mentioned the collectibles and things like that, and I have to say that this is the Arkham Knight is the only game that I've ever actually done every single side mission, every single collectible before I finished it, because of that little incentive.
Yeah, I wanted to so bad, but I kind of assumed that you get all the gadgets through the main story, and you don't. So I was left with, like, a couple Riddler trophies that required a certain gadget at the end. But again, because those side stories are so kind of focused in telling their own stories and continuous stories, it was actually pretty cool to, like, it didn't bother me as much because it's of this cool conflict to resolve and this thing to do. And it made sense, right? It's not just like, I mean, it's not like a game that goes through and dumps you back in the open world for no apparent reason. It makes sense, and it's interesting as well. It's not just go clean up the collectibles. For me, it was go clean up the collectibles and then conclude this story, because there is a conclusion to every single story.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I really like about the whole idea of the side missions, at least when I can tell, the only Arkham game I've played is Arkham City, and just the sort of relation they have to the main story, as I've heard in Arkham Knight. I like that, and I also like how the side missions kind of come gradually instead of AC games until AC4 they came gradually.
Yeah.
Starting AC4, they pretty much unlock at the same exact time, sometime early in the game, and I think that by unlocking all of them at the same time gives you less of an incentive to do it, because you just see that there's a whole bunch of things you have to do and think, oh, I'm never going to be able to do all of this. Because I'm usually the type of dude who would try and see everything as you can.
Me too.
And but with Unity, you get the map filled up with stuff, and it's like, well, it's going to take years. I'm going to just do the main story and not pay attention to much else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one thing about the collectibles and all that extra crap is that with Arkham Knight versus Unity especially, is that we talked a little bit about this on the subreddit in the last week actually, and that everything in Arkham Knight actually serves a purpose, and all the Riddler trophies and all that they have a reason behind them. While instead of just floating random cockades or 600 random chests, which I personally definitely prefer Arkham Knight's method, and I think I really hope that AC goes back to that idea.
Arkham Knight had a good balance. Like, Arkham City, I never got all the Riddler trophies because there are like over 400, but there are like there's half as many in Arkham Knight, but some of them are a lot harder to get, I think. And it's more interesting than just going like, go to this red dot on your map, do the same mini game you've done already 200 times. It's like everything is like, how do I use this gadget in a creative way to accomplish this goal? And it's really if you don't know, the Riddler trophies are all mostly hidden behind like puzzles, which are all different. There's no two puzzles that are alike. And that is definitely the way to do it. It's not just go here and get this. It's go here, do this thing, engage with the game, then do whatever. But yeah, I definitely think that's a really good way to do collectibles.
Yeah. One thing I really liked about the collectibles I most enjoy in the AC games are the ones that make you think about how to get to it. Instead of, I'm going to walk in this house and lockpick a door again. So even if the collectibles don't entirely make sense all the time, like the cockades, sometimes it's fun getting to them. I liked particularly AC2 having a meaning to a lot of the collectibles, like gather the feathers for your grieving mother.
Yeah.
Instead of collect cockades to get some new color outfits.
Yeah, and I mean, that's actually a good point. Because whereas, I mean, kind of Batman does all these puzzles because it focuses on this gadget aspect of the game. It's really important. I feel like if AC were to go a similar route, they should really focus on parkour, because honestly, for me, that's really the strength of the series, and that's why, like, I still really like the series, is the parkour. And I've gone in and out whether I appreciate more, stealth or combat, but what always sticks is the parkour. And I feel like people can argue whether it's a stealth game or a whatever game, but for me, it's really a parkour game. I mean, so I feel like for that, they should focus on their strongest system, the parkour. And that kind of feeds into the other thing I was going to say, which is that Arkham Knight side content all kind of focuses on another really strong piece of the game. I mean, you can debate over whether the Batmobile is that strong. I think the Batmobile itself is that strong. It's just like, compared to the rest of the gameplay, it's a little out of place. But like each different piece of side content kind of got you to look at the game in a different way and experience a different part of the game. Whereas all the side content in the Assassin's Creed games recently has been do the same thing 1,000 times. Yeah.
This week's weekly discussion thread is on Connor, not Kenway, aka Ratonhnhaké, aka Arkham Knight. Pretty well known as the main character of main protagonist of Assassin's Creed 3, son of Hathan, grandson of Edward Kenway. overall, a very, very interesting character. Arguably one of the most interesting characters, the most complex characters that any Ubisoft or at least any AC game has had. But I think everyone knows by now that they handled his character pretty badly, and that caused a lot of people to have really negative opinions about Connor as a whole, and to extend that over to Assassin's Creed 3 as a whole as well. Putrid, I know that you're a massive AC3 and Connor fan, so could you tell us a bit about why you like Connor?
Yeah. I just like... There seems to be a lot of thought put into him, even though it might not be directly shown, like kind of how he didn't use any contractions.
Yeah.
And how over time he learned how to successfully perform a handshake.
Yeah.
Just, I don't know, a lot of little details. I kind of like his well, getting off of Ezio, you know, he was a pretty perfect dude until he gassed a village and caused riots and revelations and whatnot. But I feel like Connor's story is a bit more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
A bit more realistic, a bit more flawed in ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting about Connor is that, I mean, you could dumb down his story to say, you know, revenge, haha, but, you know, there's more to a story than just, like, the end goal. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about Connor is that he's probably one of the only protagonists we've had that doesn't start off as... I mean, we've had a lot of white people, for one thing. And he's probably the most culturally maybe obscure protagonist we've had. Like, I mean, living in the U.S., and especially me living in Wyoming, I'm relatively near to, like, several Indian reservations. So I'm somewhat familiar with Native Americans, but it's really not... I mean, you don't see very many Native American protagonists in things. You don't see very many Native American characters at all. And those you do see are generally somewhat stereotyped and over the top. And Connor just kind of sits in this nice spot where he's really not over stereotyped. He's actually very well researched and a very deep character. And actually, that accurate portrayal is somewhat why he's disliked, because that's how those people actually act.
Yeah. One thing I like about the AC series in general is how they look at many different cultures, many different things, and they do it, I would say, pretty accurately and respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, definitely. That was actually something that was very interesting to me, to kind of, as someone from New Zealand who has extremely limited knowledge and experience with Native American people, especially since at the time of playing AC3, I was actually still in New Zealand. I hadn't moved to the US yet. I had actually never met someone, a Native American person or anything like that. I didn't know much about the culture. I didn't know much history. I didn't know much about the American Revolution or anything like that. And I actually found Connor's whole story and basically everything related to him I found very interesting and very unique. And I enjoyed learning lots about that. And when I was reading about how the Ubisoft team put tons of effort into getting it all accurate and right, and they had consultants and everyone, and I found that even more interesting. And I was glad to see that, this Native American people never, like, scalped people, and yet they had that in the game originally, and yet they were told to take that out because it wasn't quite accurate enough. And it was very interesting. And like Connor's, the meaning of Ratonhnhaké, apparently there's several different meanings behind it, and one of them, that the developers say that as a life that is scratched, which I really like. And Connor's the only assassin that has a whose English name doesn't actually refer to like an eagle or anything, or a bird at least. With because Connor refers to like lover of hounds and.
Yep. It's of Celtic origin.
Yeah.
I happen to know that because of my own life experiences.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Because some people might not know. Case from heard, probably only heard in passing stance on here that you actually have the same name as this very own character.
Yeah. I'm technically one letter different. I actually have a friend whose name is spelled that way, but he's not a big video game. He doesn't play as many video games, and what he does, he plays on like an old crappy PC. So since he wasn't going to play it, I felt that I had to take, I had to take the props for him.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
One of the scenes that might be one of my more favorite scenes in the series, actually, is the scene where Connor and Hatham go to one of Washington's camps, and Connor finds out that it was actually Washington who had burned down his village and not, Charles Lee and the Templars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at this point, that really showed that Connor had more moved on from the whole revenge thing. And it's shown, if there's all revenge he wanted, he would have killed George Washington. But I guess he could say that he might not have done that because it wasn't historically accurate. But yeah, it seemed at that point he'd really accepted the assassin ideology.
I really thought Connor's story was more about. The end goal of his story was the protection of his people, and that's why Assassin's Creed 3 is sort of a downer, because in the end he does not succeed. His people are still thrown from their land just by the new American government. They just. The Northwest Ordinance goes in place. They just partition off lands and expand, and they're like, you don't, that guy gets it now. He gets this nice square that we've drawn.
Well, I think that wraps up the episode for this week. Sorry if I sound a little less energetic than usual. I'm incredibly tired and been doing tons of stuff the last few days. So I couldn't quite pull it out for us this episode, but I hope you still enjoyed it, and I personally quite enjoy talking about these different things. And thank you for joining us, Putrid.
Thank you.
A lot of people may not realize that he was actually on a rehearsal episode we did for the podcast, so a fully recorded episode. It's up on YouTube, but is privated, so just a little tease, we may give you that at some point. But for the moment, that's just sitting there waiting to be listened to by various people. And it's quite the special episode.
Special almost as in a non-politically correct way.
No, yeah. The music in this episode is by Shock Atlas. He's a good friend of ours. It can be found in the description. You can reach us on the Assassin's Creed subreddit, which is assassinscreed.reddit.com or reddit.com/AssassinCreed, as well as on Twitter and through our email, podcast@gmail.com. Next week, Aries should be back, and myself and McCracKenway will be joined by Wayne Davies to talk a bit about the Assassin's Creed movie and his time as a YouTuber and all that good stuff. If you would like to be a guest or would like to ask us a question to answer on the show, then you can contact us in any ways listed earlier or any ways listed in the description. I see you next week.